the fact that the Soviet Union built that much housing with that little money, I think is both a testament to what you can do if you're just willing to commit to the bit, and I think an indictment of the unwillingness of Western countries to do the same. Oh, also, one thing I had been meaning to share several streams ago, by which I mean like 2 or 3 streams ago, that I will share now because I kind of forgot about it, on stream that is that what you need to do to evolve your character? Nothing. I think I can evolve right now if I wanted to, but I don't want to. In like my downtime, sometimes when I have my phone at a restaurant, whatever, sometimes I like to have something to read. I'll just pull up an article of a subject that interests me. I actually, my most recent project to that effect, or my most recent article of choice to that effect, was that I read the article, wiki article about Soviet era housing development, Soviet era housing construction in the Soviet Union. And it was really interesting. I really enjoyed reading it. And I learned a lot about housing development. For example, one of the most maligned things in the Soviet Union with respect to housing development was this process that was known as compaction. Compaction was the practice of basically trying to even out the density of housing, of people in housing across cities in the Soviet Union, which effectively meant putting people from the working class into apartments that were occupied by families of the upper classes, right? All of a sudden, the upper classes had a much more literally cramped and dense living situation, and plenty of people made their complaints known about it. And to this day, a lot of people whose entire political identity revolves around poo-pooing the Soviet Union will refer to that as one of the major failures of the Soviet Union. Only problem is, by all measurable accounts, that was one of the greatest successes of early Soviet housing development. You see, the housing situation in the Soviet Union was dire, or I should say in Russia was dire. You got to remember that, like, the Soviet Union industrialized basically out of an agrarian feudal existence in Tsarist Russia. So you went from Tsarist Russia to now socialists control the country and are saying, fuck, how do we industrialize and urbanize this country, right? Because, like, Russia barely had any cities or urban centers to speak of. I think it was basically just Moscow and St. Petersburg, which was renamed to Leningrad after the revolution because people love to be cringe and LARP, but to cringe is to live, etc., etc. So they were like, okay, first things first, we need to, or not first things first, they were also trying to shore up the housing supply, trying to build a lot more housing very quickly. But one thing they did was compaction. And homelessness, the amount of people who were living without a roof over their head actually declined precipitously by something like 30% as a result of compaction. So everybody didn't have a comfortable living situation, but way the fuck fewer people were going homeless. And I think that's actually, people conveniently skip over that. Because then once compaction had finished, what they started doing was actually building more housing. That's when they started building the kommunalkas and the unfortunate fiasco that was the Stalinkas. These different models of apartment blocks and stuff for multifamily housing. And the Soviets were very, very interested in building multifamily housing particularly. Deliver black gummy? Do I have a black gummy? No. Why would I take that job? So I found that to be very interesting, and very cool to read about this housing development. You know, you had the comunalkas in the early days with the compaction. You had a lot of barracks. You got to understand, housing was in such a sorry state in the Soviet Union that a large percentage of housing that the workers lived in, that people of the working classes and peasantry lived in, was temporary. And you could barely call that housing, right? There's a reason they call it barracks, is because it was functionally like an army barrack, but for workers at a job site. You know? That was housing in the Soviet Union kind of on the eve of the revolution. And then, you know, revolution happens, communalkas start being built with sturdy, but they tried to use very inexpensive building material primarily so they could build housing fast. They knew just how dire the housing situation was. Their priority was to build housing very quickly and basically start designing cities from scratch to have like a social core to them. And that's how you get the Soviet style of garden city. You know, fast forward through the Second World War to the afterwards period, you know, after an entire episode of the Stalinists calling affordable housing, and I'm not joking, leftist excess, these self-proclaimed Soviet communists were out here lambasting apartment buildings as leftist excess, walkable cities and garden cities, leftist excess. And they were like, we need to build single family homes. Not even kidding. After the Second World War, when Stalin died, everybody had to make a big show of how much they missed Stalin and, oh my God, boo-hoo, state mandated crying. That was a thing. And it must have fucking sucked to live in the Soviet Union for shit like that. But funnily enough, the architects, engineers, and housing sector pretty much instantly moved on. It was like, all right, now we're done with that fucker. Now let's build actual housing. Because the Stalinkas were basically like shitting out apartments for the working class if they built them at all. And it was kind of like a period of class separation where they built luxury housing for the ruling classes. A lot of the class separation that's visible in housing actually comes from the Stalin era. Because after Stalin, with Khrushchev and Brezhnev, apartment construction became so standardized that there was literally no difference between the living conditions of people in the ruling classes and people of the working classes. For all the failures of the Soviet Union, housing was not one of them. In fact, the failures of housing in the Soviet Union came as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union and how much money it was spending on other stuff. They could build a lot of this housing, but they had a hard time maintaining it. You know, the Khrushchevkas and Brezhnevkas, genuinely, in the configurations that they were built, I would hold up as modern day, like, templates of what a good affordable housing vision could look like, you know? Though, interestingly, it is not the only one. It's not the only vision of what good affordable housing could look like, because what doesn't get mentioned until very late in the article is that the Soviets truly were planning cities from scratch. It's not like, you know, nowadays we have the concept of a 15-minute city. There's sort of a standard kind of way that cities are built, with buildings very close to each other, a lot of mixed-use zoning and townhomes and conjoined apartment buildings and stuff like that. You know, if you look at the Google Earth view for cities in Europe or South America, a lot of them will look pretty similar. You'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. There are micro districts, right? Where it's like there are several small districts within a city where, like, you couldn't get from one end of the city to the other on foot because the city is huge. But if you're in any given part of the city, you can get anywhere you need to go, right? Within a reasonable amount of time. Russian cities actually don't look like that. At least the Soviet era developments. But they still have a social character. The social character is largely constructed within the apartment buildings themselves. The apartment buildings consistently through the Kommunalkas, Khrushchevkas, and Brezhnevkas, which, by the way, the Khrushchevkas are kind of like the backbone of Soviet affordable housing. They're not as high quality as the Brezhnevkas, but they are the by far most numerous type of housing unit in Russia, left over from the Soviet period. Whereas in Western cities, a lot of the social character is outside of the domicile, where like, in an apartment such as mine, you have your bedrooms, you have your kitchen, you have your dining area, you have your bathroom, right, and your closet, and that's all personal space. Interestingly, in the Soviet Union, you had your personal, like, lounging or sitting and bedrooms, but kitchens and bathrooms were communal. Kitchens, bathrooms, hallways, obviously. So people would have to use the hallways a lot more, interact with their neighbors, and there was more communal, like, seating and lounging in Soviet apartments. Not to say it took up all that much space. The kitchens and bathrooms, like, obviously a lot of these rooms were not themselves very big, because, Soviet Union, not a very wealthy country. But there was like a extraordinary effort to build communities that had a distinctly social character. So even if the layout of an apartment building versus a shop was somewhat similar to what you have in America, where the shops are typically standalone and might not be mixed use, the apartment buildings themselves were very social in character, and they would be configured in kind of like ring formations. Cities in Russia, they were built to be kind of wavy and circular, so you could have these nice winding paths with gardens and parks between each, like, block of development, right? And that was the Soviet city, basically as designed from scratch by the Bolsheviks and what later became the All-Union Communist Party, whatever. Not without its hiccups, obviously. But, like, just a profoundly interesting read, I think, on affordable housing. I think it's basically like affordable housing porn. The Soviet Union was actually one of the main attacks that the Western countries used rhetorically against the Soviet Union when they weren't rightly pointing to how much fucking state-mandated crying you had to do over the death of Stalin, right? One of the things that the West would say very frequently was, look how poor the Soviet Union is. Indeed, look how poor the Soviet Union did, and look how much fucking housing they were able to build to address the housing crisis. Did they actually fully tackle the housing crisis? No, obviously not. It's a massive, massive problem that takes way more commitment and money to solve than the Soviet Union had the time, space, or resources to do. But the fact that the Soviet Union built that much housing with that little money, I think is both a testament to what you can do if you're just willing to commit to the bit, and I think an indictment of the unwillingness of Western countries to do the same. The housing supply in the US, in a lot of Western countries, is stagnating. It's not a matter of us not having the money to build housing. It's a matter of a few random, like, extremely antisocial, evil homeowners being able to hold up the entire process. Even a very poor area, a very poor country can build housing if it wants to. And the Soviet Union is a great example of that. And I think that there are a lot of historical lessons. There's historical lessons to take from any and everywhere. That is the historical lesson we should be taking from the Soviet Union. First and foremost, I think, is the historical lesson about housing. That housing, as populations grow, as economics grow and change, whatever, as, like, especially in a society where there's, like, market class separation, whatever, in a system where people need to pay rent, housing is something you need to pay very, very key attention to, because that's one of the bedrocks of living a relatively, like, having at least something of an okay quality of life in the modern day. And, the Soviet Union could do it with that little money. So there's no reason that the Western countries out there shouldn't be able to do that too. Remember how much money they raised once they realized Zoran was a thing? Yeah, just think of how much fucking money there is available all of a sudden when somebody says, I want to build more housing, and the billionaires all of a sudden decide, no, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And all the fucking real estate people start funneling money in nonstop. Legitimately, Zoran has said they are spending more money against me than I would even tax them. By that token, they are also spending more money against Zoran Mamdani than it would take to build enough affordable housing in New York to solve the housing crisis, at least in a decent chunk of instances. There's just a profound contradiction of incentives here, right? It's more like they care about power than actual money. Yeah, it's like wealth is a measurement of power, but in the absence of wealth, they'll take power all the same, George Orwell describes this with the concept of relative profit. Billionaires and the ruling class, in many cases, are willing to burn down society just so they can remain the rulers of whatever's left. Even if it's burning cinders, they would rather rule over burning cinders than be equal in paradise. Thanks for watching, and support the channel if you would be so kind.